This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Eugenics and Other Evils by G. K. Chesterton. Section 9, Part 2, The Real Aim. Chapter 1, The Impotence of Impenitence. The root formula of an epic is always an unwritten law, just as the law that is the first of all laws, that which protects life from the murderer, is written nowhere in the statute book. Nevertheless, there is all the difference between having and not having a notion of this basic assumption in an epic. For instance, the Middle Ages will simply puzzle us with their charities and cruelties, their asceticism and bright colours, unless we catch their general eagerness for building and planning, dividing this from that by walls and fences, the spirit that made architecture their most successful art. Thus even a slave seemed sacred. The divinity that did hedge a king did also in one sense hedge a serf, for he could not be driven out from behind his hedges. Thus even liberty became a positive thing, like a privilege, and even when most men had it, it was not opened like the freedom of a wilderness, but bestowed like the freedom of a city. Or again, the 17th century may seem a chaos of contradictions, with its almost priggish praise of parliaments and its quite barbaric massacre of prisoners, until we realize that if the Middle Ages was a house half built, the 17th century was a house on fire. Panic was the note of it, and that fierce fastidiousness and exclusiveness that comes from fear. Calvinism was its characteristic religion even in the Catholic Church, the insistence on the narrowness of the way and the fewness of the chosen. Suspicion was the note of its politics. Put not your trust in princes. It tried to thrash everything out by learned, virulent, and ceaseless controversy, and it weeded its population by witch-burning. Or yet again, the 18th century will present pictures that seem utterly opposite and yet seem singularly typical of the time. The sack of Versailles and the Vicar of Wakefield, the pastorals of Watteau and the dynamite speeches of Danton. But we shall understand them all better if we once catch sight of the idea of tidying up, which ran through the whole period, the quietest people being prouder of their tidiness, civilization, and sound taste than of any of their virtues, and the wildest people having, and this is the most important point, no love of wildness for its own sake, like Nietzsche or the anarchic poets, but only a readiness to employ it to get rid of unreason or disorder. With these epics it is not altogether impossible to say that some such form of words is a key. The epic for which it is almost impossible to find a form of words is our own. Nevertheless, I think that with us the key word is inevitability, or, as I should be inclined to call it, impenitence. We are subconsciously dominated in all departments by the notion that there is no turning back, and it is rooted in materialism and the denial of free will. Take any handful of modern facts and compare them with the corresponding facts a few hundred years ago. Compare the modern party system with the political factions of the 17th century. The difference is that in the older time the party leaders not only really cut off each other's heads, but, what is much more alarming, really repealed each other's laws. With us it has become traditional for one party to inherit and leave untouched the acts of the other when made, however bitterly they were attacked in the making. James II and his nephew William were neither of them very gay specimens, but they would have laughed at the idea of a continuous foreign policy. The Tories were not conservatives. They were, in the literal sense, reactionaries. They did not merely want to keep the Stuarts. They wanted to bring them back. Or again, consider how obstinately the English mediaeval monarchy returned again and again to its vision of French possessions, trying to reverse the decision of fate. How Edward III returned to the charge after the defeats of John and Henry III, and Henry V after the failure of Edward III. and how even Mary had that written on her heart which was neither her husband nor her religion. And then consider this: that we have comparatively lately known a universal orgy of the thing called imperialism, the unity of the empire, the only topic, colonies counted like crown jewels, and the Union Jack waved across the world. And yet no one so much as dreamed, I will not say of recovering the American colonies for the imperial unity, which would have been too dangerous a task for modern empire builders, but even of retelling the story from an imperial standpoint. Henry V justified the claims of Edward III. Joseph Chamberlain would not have dreamed of justifying the claims of George III. Shakespeare justifies the French war, and sticks to Talbot, and deifies the legend of Joan of Arc. Mr. Kipling would not dare to justify the American war, stick to Burgoyne, and defy the legend of Washington. Yet there really was much more to be said for George III than there ever was for Henry V. It was not said, much less acted upon, by the modern imperialist, because of this basic modern sense that as the future is inevitable, so is the past irrevocable. Any fact so complete as the American exodus from the empire must be considered as final for aeons, though it hardly happened more than 100 years ago. Merely because it has managed to occur, it must be called first a necessary evil, and then an indispensable good. I need not add that I do not want to reconquer America, but then I am not an imperialist. Then there is another way of testing it. Ask yourself how many people you have met who grumbled at a thing as incurable, and how many who attacked it as curable. How many people we have heard abuse the British elementary schools as they would abuse the British climate. How few have we met who realize that British education can be altered, but British weather cannot. How few there were that knew that clouds were more immortal and more solid than the schools. For 1,000 that regret compulsory education, there is the hundreds or the tens or the one who would repeal compulsory education. Indeed, the very word proves my case by its unpromising and unfamiliar sound. At the beginning of our epoch, men talked with equal ease about reform and repeal. Now everybody talks about reform, but nobody talks about repeal. Our fathers did not talk of free trade, but of the repeal of the Corn Laws. They did not talk of Home Rule, but of the repeal of the Union. In those days people talked of a repealer as the most practical of all politicians, the kind of politician that carries a club. Now the repealer is flung far into the province of an impossible idealism, and the leader of one of our great parties, having said in a heat of temporary sincerity that he would repeal an act, actually had to write to all the papers to assure them that he would only amend it. I need not multiply instances, though they might be multiplied almost to 1,000,000. The note of the age is to suggest that the past may just as well be praised, since it cannot be mended. Men actually in that past have toiled like ants and died like locusts to undo some previous settlement that seemed secure, but we cannot do so much as repeal an Act of Parliament. We entertain the weak-minded notion that what is done can't be undone. Our view was well summarized by a typical Victorian song with the refrain, "The mill will never grind again the water that is past." There are many answers to this. One, which would involve a disquisition on the phenomena of evaporation and dew, we will here avoid. Another is that to the minds of simple country folk the object of a mill is not to grind water, but to grind corn, and that, strange as it may seem, there really have been societies sufficiently vigilant and valiant to prevent their corn perpetually flowing away from them to the tune of a sentimental song. Now this modern refusal to undo what has been done is not only an intellectual fault, it is a moral fault also. It is not merely our mental inability to understand the mistake we have made, it is also our spiritual refusal to admit we have made a mistake. It was the mere vanity in Mr. Brummel when he sent away trays full of imperfectly knotted neckcloths.